Well, first of all, thank you so much, Mr. Hudson, for letting me come down here. Thank you. This really excites me because this is about learning and continuing learning and getting different disciplines back here as a group, as a community. So that really warms my heart because when I look across here, there is incredible experience, there's incredible diversity, and the purpose of education really is to enlighten and inform us and to educate us and to enrich our lives and and spark conversation. So that's a privilege of mine. Now, before I start, I do have a public service announcement, which is non-political. We are going to be going into a political process, so I don't care what your political affiliation is. You'll be getting mail-in ballots. So here's the simple message. Sign it, seal it, send it. Because the ballot means nothing if you don't do that by mail-in ballots. And then, of course, I was told, I thought brilliantly, sell it, which means that there are members in your family, friends, and our political process and your franchise, the right that you have to vote is so important. You really have to, unfortunately, sell it and tell people to get engaged. So thank you so much. So that's my PSA for the day, okay? The other thing is that I thought about how I might want to present something to you today. And it has a sort of a political notion in the sense that we are a country of laws. We are a participatory democracy. And as I started to think about what I wanted to present to you and talk to you about, a couple of themes started to come together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about my role as a prosecutor, how I see certain horizons converging, give you two examples of it, and then really what I want to do is then open it up for questions and answers, because I think it's really important to try to answer for you, because I think you all have a lot of thoughts and questions, and I think I find that to be really the most productive part of what we do. And so I hope you'll indulge me in that in this exercise. So my name is Gill. I'm the Salt Lake County District Attorney. I've been a public prosecutor for about 23 years. It's an elected position, and when we think about a public prosecutor, you know, it's kind of interesting. I think people have a lot of different ideas of what this represents. But I'll tell you what it means to me, and what, as we go into the 21st century squarely, how I define it. Being a public prosecutor really is nowadays, I think you have to have a commitment to community engagement. You cannot be in elected office or the privilege of elected office, which is a public service, and be alien to your community, and you need to really be sensitive to that community engagement. And it becomes more relevant when you think about it in the role of public prosecution. It is also an independent and accountable function that it's not generally an appointed, in some jurisdiction it is, but here it's an elected official. So it is independent and accountable because it is in service of a particular institution where citizens come together and say, go and we want you to represent us and hopefully the values and the ideals that we have. And independence and accountable means also a checks and balances of the interplay with the other public institutions. As a 21st century modern prosecution, I think we also have to acknowledge that we have to be data driven, that we need to make our decisions based on research and data rather than just gut hunches. We've gotten away with it maybe in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, but it really is now to a level of work that we do in public prosecution where data is an incredible part of what we do. You know, when I was a line prosecutor, I remember when I was just fresh out of law school, and my attitude was, boy, if I get somebody who's doing their first time, I'm just going to bring the hammer on them and I'll show them the inside of a jail, and that will just get their attention, right? But which intuitively makes great sense. But when you look at the data and the research, is that if I follow on that, which many people still do and some people still intuitively believe, what our data and research tells us is that if I take that first-time offender with low risk and low needs, and I put them in a jail cell with somebody who's a hardened criminal, I've actually enhanced an opportunity for learning new things, and it's actually counterintuitive and productive to the objective that I'm trying to achieve. So when you look at data in that sense, it starts to say, well, maybe my decisions need to be modified. We need to also recognize that we have a responsibility as public prosecutors to pursue innovation in a way that actually has an impact on why we're there. One important part, which is to reduce recidivism, the reoffense by which people engage in criminal conduct. And again, that data and research is an important part that contributes to that reduction of recidivism objective that we have. And then also we need to be collaborative as we think about modern prosecution. We need to recognize that we need to go outside of the cocoon that we feel for ourselves in our elected positions, and we define ourselves as an arm of law enforcement, and that we need to actually have to reach across other systems and other partners in a collaborative way. Because when you think about the criminal justice system as a system, it's not in isolation. It can't be in isolation because there is so much interdependencies that we have. And once you start to recognize that we're part of a system, so if I was to say, for the sake of argument, every person on this front row represents an institution which is part of the criminal justice system, and your tax dollars that I get to try to solve this issue, you know, these first three folks might say, we've got innovation, here's all the great research, and we're making our commitment this way. But two other stakeholders may have a different idea. And as a result, our best efforts may be negated by our own actions, and we're actually moving away from the objectives that we want to achieve. So as a systems approach, we all have to bring all the stakeholders together to make sure that our policy decisions aren't counterproductive to the commitments of our other stakeholders in the model. And that's a different paradigm shift. And sometimes we say, well, geez, we're doing the very best that we can, and we're not getting the results that we want. So I highlight these things out to you as sort of the role, and as I think about what our role as public prosecution really is about. And these are the challenges that confront us if we start to think about it. The other thing that I want to kind of touch upon to sort of draw my ideas together today, over the last 23 years, I've kind of developed a hypothesis when it comes to the criminal justice system. And here's my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that when public policy makers fail to address the core issues of economic justice, political justice, about education, public health, housing, when we as public policy makers fail to address those core policy issues, then that failure to answer that creates deficits or crisis in our community as a consequence of those public policy failures. And historically, we have relied upon law enforcement to be our crisis managers, okay? And as crisis managers in application of trying to do crisis management through those public policy failures, the application of it, when we look at it, has disproportionately impacted communities of color and communities of poverty. And that is sort of the system that we're at. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people who commit really violent crimes, and we respond to them appropriately, and we jail them, and we want to incapacitate them as much as we can, because that is what is constituted by the need for public safety. But as a broad public policy of simply pushing law enforcement out as the managers of our crisis historically, we have also led to this outcome. We jail more human beings in the United States of America than any other country in the world. We are number 1, China's number 2, Russia's number 3, Cuba used to be number 4, Brazil is now, I think, overtaking them and coming down there. And I've been talking about this now for about 15 years or so, but I want you to just pause for a second. China's number 2, Russia's number 3, Cuba used to be number 4. And the irony was not lost on me that we had the 3 most totalitarian regimes on earth that jailed less people in net head body count than the most freest country in the world when we say we are number one. We went from the mid-1980s of spending about $7 billion a year as a nation to prop up our incarceration state to currently spending in excess of $72 billion a year to prop up our incarceration state. Now, as soon as I say that, it is not unreasonable for somebody to say, well, hang on, Sim. If there's people who are out there committing crime, maybe we should be locking them away because that's really what we should be doing. And I don't disagree with you. So the question becomes, what is the return on investment are we getting for the money that we're already obligating ourselves to spend? And here's what we're getting when you look at the research. What we're getting is that 2/3 of the people that we will release from prison will be behind bars within 36 months of their release. So we are on a trajectory to bankrupt ourselves, and we are on a trajectory that from a public policy perspective is not even giving us a return on investment that we feel that we're obligated to make. So the question becomes, how do we address that part of it? Now, these are political decisions. These are decisions that policy decisions. So I want to put that off to the side. Then you sort of enter in as a role of a prosecutor. So let me sort of come to our current times and segue to this way. Again, although what I'm about to say may have political connotations, but I want you to not think of it in political terms, but rather as an observational fact that I'm bringing for us for the purposes of our discussion. When we think about our political landscape, we are in a mindset of this very alienated space. We have the left and the right. We have the liberal and we have the conservative. We have the us and the them. We have you're for something or against something. We have these binary choices that we're sort of separating, and we're saying that it has to be one or the other. It has led to a level of political dialogue where we wouldn't even call it political dialogue and conversation anymore. It has become more accusatory. And there is a level of frustration that we are certainly witnessing in this ether space of national politics. And it is also sort of by osmosis coming to a local level, that you and I can go into our own neighborhoods and into our own communities, and there is this duality of us, them, for, against that seems to be pervasive as well. And I point that out because that creates a sense of alienation. It creates a sense of cynicism. It creates a sense of distrust. And being removed from the institution of powers in the way that we feel that we are getting the response that we want. Now, I put that out there because the two things that I do want to talk about, I want to put it and juxtapose that mindset there because those are some of the things that will kind of push back against that. So, as a public prosecutor, as a publicly elected official, as a person who goes through a political process and is empowered to run an institution, there are expectations from our citizens and our communities for some sort of an outcome and output from that election or that responsibility or privilege that we're given. And I think that's a legitimate sort of ask. So when I think about the role of a public prosecutor, it's that interesting space. It's not really national office, and it's not really the PTA president, but it's that interesting space of community expectations from a political public service perspective where I get to put one foot into the world of the ideals that we have, and then by necessity the other foot into the pragmatic performance of what I have to do. So what I mean by that is we know intuitively our ideals that bring us back as a community, as a nation of Americans. There are the ideals of truth, justice, fairness, equality, and representative government where you feel that the institutions that are there are created in service of you. That's our ideal. That's what we believe in, right? My father emigrated from India in 1969. And we came in 1971. my father didn't come to this country to be a Democrat or a Republican. My father came here to be an American and the ideals that this nation represents. The beacon of liberty that shines out to the rest of the world isn't defined in terms of political identities, but rather by the ideals of truth, justice, fairness, equality, representative government, right? That's what our expectations are as a nation and ultimately of our institutions. And so those ideals inform me when I think about my role as a public prosecutor. The other part is there is the pragmatic reality of somebody who involves themselves in a robbery or murders somebody or shoots somebody, and the real visceral need for public safety and the practical and pragmatic response of how we're going to address. And I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that when we think in the most idealistic terms of our public service, it is a convergence between our best ideals and our practical responses. And I don't care what agency you are, whether it's the EPA, whether it's the DA's office, or it's a city council, we are supposed to try to figure out how those convergences of our expectations occur. And that's a legitimate expectation if we get away from just an accusatory binary choice of right and wrong. So when I think of my role as a public prosecutor, that's a very unique space that I get to inhabit. And I find that deeply fascinating. So now the question is, and what I want to do, sort of segue from here, to give you two examples of where that need and that expectation converges with the ideals that we have, and then my hypothesis that I suggested. The first one is in the issue of officer-involved shootings. And many of you have heard about this. This is not something just unique to us in Salt Lake. This is something that is national. Ferguson comes to mind when we talk about that. So when you think about the issue of officer-involved shootings, it's fascinating because it is about a group of individuals who feel disconnected from their institutions of power. They look at law enforcement as this monolithic entity that is segregated away from the immediacy of their existence and their lives. I have communities of color and communities of poverty that feel alienated from the decision-making, from the process, from the information of how these things are analyzed and how this institution of power comes and impacts their communities. And there's a visceral response of distrust and a lack of accountability. And that to me is a legitimate concern. I don't minimize that. On the other side, I have in the institution of my law enforcement community who have a difficult job to do, who are going into very dynamic situations where there is violence that's occurring. And they're there to uphold and maintain a certain level of law and order. And they're trying to actually they're trying to address that crisis in the community. And when those two horizons meet, there is somebody pulls out a gun and somebody gets shot. And there is a loss of life. And I'm not trying to minimize the criminal conduct that might have gotten somebody there. But I think as a value for us as a society, whenever there is a loss of human life, regardless of where they're from, that our legitimacy, our integrity comes from our capacity to be able to question that event and to be able to say, why did this happen? How did this happen? Who is accountable for it? Or somebody should or should not be accountable. To me, that is the hallmark of our participatory democracy. But it is these two horizons that are converging. And there is and implicated in that is that whole notion of equity and fairness, about generational poverty, of a culture of mass incarceration, the stereotype which sometimes may drive and fuel that fear of how I'm going to interact with that person. It may be about whether I see the dignity of the person in front of me, which moves away within the response that I give. And so for my community, which is Black Lives Matter, or Utahns Against Police Brutality, or other activist groups, this is a very real, visceral concern, because there is a concern, a legitimate concern, about institutional bias, institutional racism, and about these concerns that we are not talking about in an open and honest way. You know, it's sort of like I gave a speech at NAACP a couple of years ago. And I had and I had talked about it because Black Lives Matter had just sort of come out, and I'd taken my first vacation in 15 years, and I took 2 books to read on my vacation. I read James Baldwin, The Fire the Next Time, and right after that I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And it was fascinating to me, while these books were about 70 years apart, they were still talking about the same issue of a community that felt alienated and removed from its institutions of power. And then when Black Lives Matter comes forward and they talk about Black Lives Matter, and there is this intuitive desire to say, well, hang on a second, I can do one better. All lives matter. And then there is a pause within the African American community to say, hang on a second, don't say that. And then we say, well, hang on, how can you not accept that? Because all lives matter. And I don't think anybody's arguing that all lives don't matter. But I think you have to understand it from their perspective, because they say the reason maybe we don't agree with that is because when you use the word all, and have used the word all historically, we have never been part of that all, right? So when you look at that, it starts to explain the challenge that we have and why this community would want to question that. On the other side, I have many men and women in law enforcement who do their job honorably. They do it with great professionalism, with great distinction in the line of fire and in a dynamic violent situation. And they react. And those men and women who do their job honorably and professionally deserve, through our participatory democracy, the statutory framework which says under what condition you can use lethal force. And that really is the byproduct of all of you, right? Your legislature created the statutory framework, or the law that I am obligated to apply, not out of some vacuum because Gill believes in it. It's because our legislature, under your authority, created a statute that says that if a police officer feels that they are in danger for their loss of life or somebody else, that if they can use lethal force and it will be justified, right? So it's there. Now, over the last 8 years, I probably looked at about 60 plus officer-involved shootings. And I've justified majority of them because there were men and women doing what they were supposed to be doing at the place that they were doing. But the integrity of a system is not measured by all the 99.9% that I'm going to clear. It is really measured by that 1% or that 1/10 of 1% or whatever, when somebody does not use their power in the way they were supposed to be, and our process and ability to call them out and say that this shooting was not justified, and this person should be held accountable, and that this is the process by which we go along. And that creates an incredible tension. And this is something that is being played out. And as the Black Lives Matter started to talk about it, it implicated broader issues of mass incarceration, of poverty, of generational poverty, of our sometimes good intentions that give us bad outcomes. Just most recently, for example, our state of Utah did a justice reinvestment, which was an attempt at criminal justice reform. And they were very happy to demonstrate that we had actually reduced our sending people to prison by 22%, which is something to applaud and celebrate. But what was fascinating for me when I looked at that statistic was, while we reduced 22% people going to prison, we also increased by about 21.5% minorities increase going to prison. And now that was fascinating for me to look at. And it was fascinating because our intention was to reduce the prison population, which is an admirable goal, but at the same time engaging in those reform policies. The unintended consequence was that we increased our prison population by 21.5% for the minority population. And that, to me, was the opportunity to step back and look at where that institutional bias might be coming in that we sometimes don't recognize, right? So this is why this question of officer-involved critical incidents is so important. And you can see now it starts to implicate a wide variety of public policy issues that we have to address. So I'm going to put that to the side. The second example that I want to bring to you is Operation Rio Grande, which many of you probably have heard. This came about as a result of our homeless shelter that was there. And we had a disturbance in the community in terms of these individuals that were there. And it had gotten to a level of crisis where if you and I were to drive down in its heyday, that we would actually see open use that was occurring. People were literally pulling out their heroin kit, heating up their fix, and injecting themselves in a public setting. That was the level of chaos that was prevalent there. And at that point, we came together at the state, county, and at the city level, and with a commitment as a systems approach to address that issue. And it was done and it's being done in 3 phases, right? The first part is the law enforcement piece of it, which was that if there was a group of people, there were 2 types of individuals that were there. There were people who were mentally ill, there were people who were drug addicted and substance abuse, people whose infrastructure of support in their lives had eroded or was lost, and they found themselves homeless and often self-medicating themselves out of their misery or their mental illness. So they were the consumers who were consuming for a lack of a robust public health system, and they're doing that. The second group were the predators, the people who were profiting off the misery and exploiting their status, and as a result, trafficking in that illegal substance. And they were the ones who were the suppliers, and they were the ones who were predatory. And the law enforcement effort was really to kind of separate the 2, bring a law enforcement presence in, to bring some order into the scenario, to then start to separate those 2, and which led to the second phase of what we were doing, which is that if you have such a large population of people, you can do the law enforcement piece, but then you actually have to focus on the treatment component of it. You just simply can't arrest somebody who is a drug-addicted person, which is a disease, or somebody who's mentally ill, and because they're mentally ill and they don't have access to medication, and if self-medication, some people don't like it when I say it this way, but I call illicit drugs in our homeless community or community of poverty really is a poor man's medication for the mentally ill. If the voices in my head won't let me sleep, and if I take this illicit drug, which allows me to dull my senses so I can sleep, it's a way that I'm managing my physical health, my mental health need. And often with a population of homeless who are mentally ill, their drug addiction isn't some recreational way to do it. It really speaks to the idea of a poor man's or poor person's medication of self-medicating. Right? And so we saw that this was what we were also seeing, and we cannot make an impact in our community to deliver on what your expectation as a citizenry is if we don't also address the issue of treatment. So we recognize that. And then, of course, the third component to Operation Rio Grande is the dignity to work. Because just like in our criminal justice system, it's premised on the notion of rehabilitation. We know that there's a small percentage of people who we are going to have to incapacitate and remove from society because they are a genuine risk to our public safety. But our assumption as a nation has always been that when somebody pays their due, the debt that they owe to society, that somehow they'll be able to come back into society. But the problem is that we have not created the infrastructure of that transition back into society. And so it perpetuates the model that we have already created. So the dignity to work is really about self-sufficiency. It's about housing. It's about ability to get a job. And that was the way that we approached Operation Rio Grande. And we're going into our second year of it. But also what became available there, that as a prosecutor that you wouldn't think about. All of a sudden, Medicaid expansion became a high priority for me. Now you may say, well, Sim, you're a public prosecutor. What do you care about Medicaid expansion? Well, let me tell you why I care about Medicaid expansion. And this gives you an idea to what I suggested earlier to you, how we're systemically connected. And if my hypothesis is correct, and if we're systemically connected, why we also need to be politically connected in the decisions that we make. So let me tell you why Medicaid expansion is important. Because if you and I were to walk down to the Salt Lake County Jail right now, and we were to take a slice of people who are there, we would recognize that between 60 to 65% on any given time of the people who are at the jail at 138% of poverty, full Medicaid expansion, would benefit directly to access to treatment as a result of that. Okay? So if we're talking about treatment, and we're talking about rehabilitation, and if we're talking about criminal justice reform, if we're talking about the social ills that we're trying to impact, then Medicaid expansion as a political decision, as a policy decision, becomes critical to me as a public prosecutor to help alleviate this challenge that is confronting us all, right? So I share that with you as one element of how these different horizons converge together in the role that I do as a public prosecutor. And that really is the takeaway that I want you to take away from this. I, as a public prosecutor, get to put one foot in the realm of ideals which we all believe in. The other foot in the pragmatic reality of the challenges that each one of us faces and confronts as a part of our public policy failures manifesting themselves as crises in our community. So the challenge for you as an informed citizenry then is not just sharing of information, but it really becomes an issue of owning the responsibility and the privilege of being a citizen. I shared with you earlier why my father came here and why we emigrated here. We came here because of those ideals that are represented, but also because of the notion that we would be empowered as individuals in this society to be able to author the kind of changes that we want to change. That we're part of a participatory democracy where it was our responsibility as citizens to help author those changes and to see if the changes that are being articulated consistently reflect the ideals that we believe as a common people. Not as left or right, not as liberal or conservative, but the ideals that we represent of the society that we want to create. And that means, in a roundabout way, to my public service announcement. Because that is not my responsibility, that is every single one in this room's responsibility. The institution that it is my privilege to represent is only an institution if we are consistent with our ideals in service of you. The district attorney's office does not belong to me. I'm a temporary caretaker, and I am there at your behest. Now, whether you're talking about a district attorney, a mayor, or county council, that is really the ideal that informs our participatory democracy. That the people that we elect are there to represent us, not that we serve them. That was the lesson I learned when my family emigrated here. And that is the lesson that I look at as a challenge in the institution that I have right now and the privilege as a DA. And that is the same conversation that people who are on the margins of society, Black Lives Matter, or intergenerational poverty, or people whose schools are not being funded, whose water quality is going down, as citizens in our community, have a reason and a right to cry out and ask of our public officials and our public institutions, we shouldn't be afraid of you, but you're supposed to be here to serve us. And you can see why that idea and premise then becomes relevant to people of color and poverty who feel that there is a disproportionate use of force under the laws that we've created, impacting one community more than another. And you can see why it makes sense for other people whose public policy failures have left them with no public health, no transitional housing, deficit in education, a sense of no social justice or political access, who feel that they have been generationally moved through the criminal justice system as the byproduct of our social response for crisis management. Because historically, we have relied, as I proposed to you earlier, as a matter of our public policy, my hypothesis, that when our public policy makers fail to address the needs of social justice, political justice, economic justice, public health, access to the levers of power through participatory democracy, those public policy failures manifest themselves as crisis in the community. And maybe we need to stop, reflect, and see if the avenue of approach that we have over-relied historically upon, which is law enforcement to be the crisis manager, whether that is sound policy or not. So with that, I'll stop there, and we'll start some questions and answers. Thank you very much. So, does anybody have a question that I might be able to answer? Anything you want. It's my privilege to come in and we can talk about anything you like. Yes?
So is there a direct correlation with two things, with the war on drugs and the private prisons, where you see the numbers of people going up?
Okay, that's the question is there a direct correlation with the war on drugs and private prisons, and I think incarceration in general? I think absolutely. I think our public policy as a matter of war on drugs it really was not data-driven. It was more retributive in nature. And remember, when we came out with these campaigns, they were also directed more directly on the inner city, which were communities of poverty and communities of color, right? And I'll give you a perfect correlate. First of all, the other part is absolutely. And then we went to this idea of 3 strikes, you're out kind of laws, where we increased and ballooned our mass incarceration. So we made a policy decision, and then the question became, how was that policy applied, and against who was it applied, and what did it do to us fiscally? It absolutely skyrocketed our incarceration rates, right? That's one of the reasons why when we talk about criminal justice reform, we talk about and recognizing drug addiction as a disease. And here's the number, I mean, depending on what study you look at, roughly about 70, if you're a drug addict, and I simply prosecute you and arrest you and prosecute you and I put you in jail, the recidivism rate is about 72 to 75%. When that person does their time, they come back, they're going to do the same thing. But if you actually can engage them in treatment, that drops down to about 23 to 24, 25%. That's a huge reduction. And if you think about removing that person from cycling through, systemically, the impact it does on our costs that we're funding this is a huge, huge impact. Now, when it comes to private prisons, I think just on a philosophical level, I don't think that we should be privatizing prisons because there's a profit motive and agenda that gets attached to that. But having said that, it also, you need to kind of step back and look at it as well, because then what is it that we're not doing as efficient, fiscally conservative managers of our resources, that we're running our prisons in a way that we can't run them efficiently in terms of without waste, right? Look, I'm a Democrat, I'm a progressive, but I'm also probably a right in terms of fiscally conservative for my colleagues. Because it's not my money, it's your money. And the way I was raised in my household is I don't get to spend my dad's money, right? My dad might give me an allowance, or I earn my own money and I spend my own money, but I don't get to go down and spend my dad's money or my mom's money. And so I'm a fiscal conservative. So we need to examine structurally what is it that we're doing that we're having these cost overruns. One is that, first of all, here's the bottom line. I sometimes used to say it this way. Right now there's about 2,200 jail beds down at the county. But if you gave me 4,000 jail beds, I can fill them. If you give me 6,000 jail beds, I can fill them. Heck, I could even make an argument for you to give me 8,000 jail beds and I could fill those too. But there's a cost that's attached to it that comes from your pocket as taxpayers. And the question you have to ask, and which you should be asking of me and every other elected person is, why are you spending it the way that you're doing? What is the return on investment? The earlier point that I made to you, right? And so the war on drugs led to a series of domino effects which really skyrocketed our jail population. We're learning from that. And I'll tell you, so this may be a little uncomfortable truth. So, but again, I do it not in an accusatory way, but as an observational fact for us for a discussion. When we increase those penalties, and there's research that's been done, cocaine, which was being used in white suburban households, had a lesser penalty for the same thing, which was crack cocaine in a different form in the inner city. So you ended up with different sentencing structures. And as a result, you had a community of poverty and color that was being jailed and sent to prison. And then the collateral consequences of that is intergenerational poverty and intergenerational participation in the criminal justice system. These are also costs that we pick up. It didn't solve anything. And most recent phenomena, to give you another example of that correlate, is this. When we think about heroin, we've always thought of it as an inner city issue. I've been going through, before we did Operation Rio Grande, we did Operation Diversion as a small set operation to gather data to inform us so we could make the decision for Operation Rio Grande. And what was fascinating when we did Operation Rio Grande, Operation Diversion, which was the preface to that, 90%, over 90% of the people that we had came in contact were heroin addicts. And we had now seen this new turn of increase in heroin addiction, which we thought we had kind of pushed back. Well, the reason it was because it goes full circle to the opioid issue of big pharma and the pharmaceuticals that were putting that out. And all of a sudden, it became a national crisis because as those pharmaceutical addictions went from the pills to the cheaper form of heroin, the heroin addiction of it went into white suburbia. And it was the alarm of white suburbia that finally said that we have a national epidemic. And I bring that out as an observation of how the notion of urgency came here, because it wasn't something with them over there, with that group. It was now everywhere. It was all of us, right? And that's a fascinating thing to think about how we politically respond and from a policy perspective respond. Yes, ma'am?
Along that note, I believe that there are some states that are suing
Yes.
the pharmaceutical companies. What's Utah doing?
As the Salt Lake County District Attorney, with the permission of my mayor and my council, we have filed litigation against Big Pharma, and we're suing Big Pharma for having contributed, knowingly contributed, it is our position, and knowing what the dangers were through an aggressive marketing scheme where they underplayed their own results and their information to get this for pure reason of profits. As a result, they've left communities like Salt Lake County with an overburdened addicted population for which I'm using now, and we're trying to use your tax dollars to address their profits. So we have filed a lawsuit against Big Pharma, and we're suing them.
Is Utah alone in it, or are you in a group with them?
So for us, it's Salt Lake County because we are the largest county. There are other counties around the state, around the country that have done it. Some have come together as groups. Some have come independently. You have states who are suing them. You have municipalities and counties who are suing them. So it's really, the litigation is across the board.
How long do you think this process will take?
I don't know, but I think it's important to push back and at least recognize what the collateral consequences have been for us as a community as a result of that practice. I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm going to have my numbers slightly off, but it'll give you the flavor of what these numbers represent. I think in Salt Lake County we have something like 50,000 addicts or something like that, and we have really room for about 4,500 or 5,000 of them. And when you go down to the younger age from about, I think about 12 to 14 to 18, we have about 4,500, maybe 4,000 addicts, and we really have room for about 300 or 400 of them. That is what we're pushing back against in terms of the collateral consequences of the impact of that decision on our community. Yes, sir.
You haven't mentioned, well, to my satisfaction, anyway, how does the business community receive these people? Are they active in hiring to get them back?
On the transition part, on the back end.
Or are they just newbies, not a white back?
Yeah. So that's a great question. How is the business community reacting to these individuals as part of, I think, this homeless population? I think the jury is still out in this respect. The issue is that you have to kind of step back, and even as I work with my partners and we look at it, we realize that this is a big, comprehensive challenge. I think, for example, the 2-year effort collectively is going to cost about $67 million, right? And the counties are putting in their share, the cities are putting in their share, the state is putting in. So it is not a small number. And I think that as we bring people in, that's where we're finding these deficits. The biggest deficit that I have right now is how do we scale up the treatment needs. So when we talk to people like Tim Whalen, my mayor, my council, we're talking about, okay, we're getting maybe Medicaid waivers, we're getting Medicaid expansion. How do we get scale up the need, the treatment component? And you've got community providers who are saying, well, hang on, is the resource going to be there to help us with that? Now that's in the treatment. The same thing is true for transitional housing and employment and jobs. Our job is to first get the person on the trajectory of success, get them engaged in treatment, and then have a safe place while they're transitioning through their treatment success and coming off their addiction that is a stable residence. And then as more stable they become, then to start to push into employment. Because if you're an employer, you may believe what I'm saying, but if I'm still sending you people who are addicted, you're trying to run a business, you're going to say, Sim, thank you, I believe what you're doing, but I can't take the risk. So what I'm suggesting to you is it's a much more elongated process. And within that elongated process, we have deficits lacking the infrastructure or support to really transition that person. Now, the good thing is we're starting to recognize that it's not just simply jailing somebody, taking them through 10 courses of therapy, and then putting them out on the street and say, good luck with that. Because they're just going to get cycled back through, and then our initial investment will not give us a return on investment that we're hoping to get. So it's really forcing all policymakers. So here's an interesting thing. When I talked about one of the principles of being collaborative, right? I have to be collaborative with the sheriff, with my mayor, with my council, and we all have to talk about how those scarce dollars we're all fighting for impact us. And we have to, and with the Legal Defenders Association, okay, maybe the knee-jerk reaction of trying to send this person to prison is wrong, but maybe diverting them into a treatment is important. And geez, how do we, once they come out of treatment, where are we supposed to be, where's the housing stock for transitional housing? I mean, as a district attorney, I'm having a conversation with Ed Blake from Habitat for Humanity and some private developers because I'm trying to figure out what's the solution. As a DA, I'm trying to say, do I build tiny homes, right? Do I agitate to say that we give waivers to developers if they'll take 10% of their housing stock and make it available for affordable housing and low-income housing? And we have to start having these, and I'm having this conversation as the district attorney. Because if I've got somebody who I've arrested, gotten them into treatment, and they're between 1 and 3 years of their trajectory of success, I want to give them stable residence from another 2 to 4 years while they can be gainfully employed, be on their feet, and then step out of the cycle of criminal justice. And I have to kind of think holistically. And again, I keep coming to my hypothesis. When I was a line prosecutor and I would get to sentencing somebody, I would sit there, and when we would try to construct a sentence, here's the things that we were trying to construct. Where is he going to get his treatment needs? Where is his physical needs are going to be met? Where is he going to stay? Does he need to finish his education? And can he be gainfully be employed? All those things that I mentioned to you are public policy failures of my hypothesis on the earlier part of the equation. And now on the back end, we're trying to recreate that, and that's the most expensive investment for recreating that structure, if we're willing to take the policy up front. Yes, ma'am. Here.
You mentioned the Medicaid expansion.
Yes.
Can you just kind of explain what why it doesn't go? I mean, I can't think.
Why it wasn't that?
Why do some people not think it's a good idea?
Well, because on Medicaid expansion, there's a 90-10 match. The federal government will give you your tax dollars back at 90 cents on 10 cents that you put in. So some states have taken the position of saying, well, that's 10%, 10 cents that we don't want to spend. And that's fine. But the irony is those are your tax dollars, and if we don't, these are tax dollars from Utah. If we don't want them, I suspect Georgia or Florida is more than happy to have them. Now, having said that, that's a policy decision. That's a political decision. And so my pushback to my policymakers is, if you are going to exercise the authority to not do that, then what is the alternative that you're going to provide? Because we're leaving, $400 million, $800 million on the table. Because if you are going to take the privilege of elected office and policy making, then you have to own the responsibility of coming up with another viable alternative that can meet the needs of this that we're trying to address, right? And it is not acceptable. Here's the analogy that I've used. We can do partial waiver, we can do this. So for example, again, I'm going to give you round numbers, not exact, so whoever is there, please don't hold me accountable saying you were off by 5,000 people or whatever. I'm already admitting that. I think it's somewhere right around 125,000 to 150,000 Utahns who would be impacted by full Medicaid expansion at 138% of the poverty level. So here's the analogy that I use. I think in pictures. So it's sort of like saying that I have a high rise that is on fire. And let's say if there's 150,000, let's say there are 150 people in there. Okay? And so we are responding as a community. And we're going to make a conscious decision to say, we will only save 100 of them, but we're going to let 50 of them perish. Okay? Now, when you think of it in those graphic terms as a thought experiment, it starts to bring home the reality of what we're doing when we make those public policy decisions. And, in fact, we had ladders that are long enough, we could have saved all 150 of them. So we made a decision. We can use a 100-foot ladder, or we can use a 85-foot ladder. But 85-foot ladder will save 100 people. But if we used a 100-foot ladder, or let's say even more directly, a 138-foot ladder at 138% of the poverty level, we could save everybody. I think we have to own that decision. And if you're going to exercise that, then you need to give me viable alternatives. Now, my personal belief is our legislature miserably failed us. And that is why we have a ballot initiative this November, because majority of the Utahns said, no, that's our money, we want it, and you're not listening to us. That's why it's on the ballot measure. And that goes full circle to where I ended up. That's where all of you have a role to play. Yes, ma'am.
So I love how you framed the issue with the policymakers, with your role, with businesses. And I think another public service announcement is like everybody sitting here, we moved here a couple of years ago from Philadelphia. And what I'm impressed by are all of the people involved in community efforts, like people sitting here, opportunities we all have with the 4th Street Clinic.
Yes.
With the YWCA and
Yes.
women. There's a ton of things we can do on a day-to-day basis while you're out doing your DA stuff and,
Yes, ma'am.
the legislature. So anyway,
Yes.
I'm just saying.
I think that is a wonderful observation, because at the end of the day, to me, I come from the eastern part of the world, and the way I was raised philosophically and spiritually, everything is connected, right? There's nothing in isolation. Everything is connected, and you're right. And even when I talk about this, everything is connected, and that connection at the end comes to the integrity of the persons who are sitting in this room. And I think that's really where it is there. So I'm sorry, I'm going to work my way down this way, yes.
What, if anything, is being done in planning for the new prison by the airport to reduce recidivism?
Okay, so what's being done to reduce recidivism as we move into the new prison that we're going to be building there? What's happening at the state level is the attempt was a couple of years ago with justice reinvestment. It is addressing the issues of it decriminalized from a third-degree felony, some drug offenses, to Class A misdemeanors. It is institutionalizing organizationally risk need assessments, so we're making our decisions on treatment based on data and research rather than emotion. It is trying to address the issue in some of our sentencing guidelines and structure. It is trying to recognize that maybe we just don't throw the book away on nonviolent offenders versus violent offenders. So there are reform efforts that are being done. And justice reinvestment to me was wonderful, because I've been advocating these issues for 18 years, and it was great for me to go from the city to the county and then to see the state step in. The problem was, it's now connected to the earlier question, that we premised justice reinvestment on the idea of full Medicaid expansion, and then we didn't do full Medicaid expansion, right? So we learned that lesson. The methodology is correct, the organizational restructuring is sound, but if we do not fund it with the right amount of resources, then we're not going to get the outcome that we want. And the best analogy, again, I think in pictures, the best analogy that I can give you is sort of like when you go to a doctor and the doctor says, here's the diagnosis that I have, and here is the treatment, and here's what then the instructions are. Now, when you start taking this, you got to take it for 10 days, right? And you're going to start feeling good about day 3 and day 4, but you need to continue doing it, because if you stop at day 3 or day 4, this is going to come back as a boomerang, and you're going to be worse off. And we tried to do criminal justice reform. We knew the prescription was for 10 days. We kind of funded it for 3 or 4. And the intent was right, but the follow-through didn't occur there. Ma'am, you had a question.
This is an issue that's never addressed. There is a chronic homeless population.
Yes.
These people don't necessarily think like anybody in
Yes.
this room. They don't necessarily want to have a job.
Yes.
They don't necessarily want to have a roof over their head.
Absolutely.
They don't like roofs.
Yes.
And none of these policies ever address the chronically homeless. They assume, there's the assumption that these people are acutely homeless.
Absolutely.
So, what do you propose to that?
That's it. So first of all, the question is, look, when we talk about homelessness, if I may paraphrase, we kind of lump everybody together with a rational frame of reference, and we assume because we're rational, there's going to be rational responses organizationally, and it doesn't happen. And that is absolutely correct. You've nailed one part of that, which is a critical part of that equation, which is that one of the things that we need to recognize, that this is not something that is going to give us 100% eradication. The issue then is not 100%. We would love to have it, but because of individuals or situations, we may not. The idea here is that our current methodology is not giving us the outcome that we want. And if we change it, we will be able to dramatically impact at least a subset as a group that is not getting its needs met. Out of that subset of a group, there is going to be a subset of a population, even statistically small, which is not going to respond to that. But as a systemic response, if we can tease off 85 or 95%, and then we're left with that 5%, then we're going to have to come up with other methodologies. So one example, for example, when you think about it, it sort of goes like this. So you have field, that's where the contact occurs. And you have some sort of a law enforcement action. And at that point, there's either an arrest that occurs. That arrest then goes to jail, if you can get them to jail, but there's overcrowding. So what happens is that because of overcrowding, this person gets released back and we're starting that cycle again. But those that are arrested there, some may go into treatment. And with all the different things that we've taught. And some of them say, Sim, go pound sand. I don't care all the treatment in the world that you're going to give to me. And this person may go to jail or may go to prison. Okay? And there are some people, if you gave me $1 million and I could spend $1 million on this person, I'm not going to get any better outcomes than I'm getting right now. And I acknowledge that. So here's what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is we're saying that if we start here with 10 contacts, and if we're going to go to prison, I want to send to prison maybe that 2 people, because maybe I can peel 8 people through that process. Rather than taking all 10 people, not give them any services, and move all these 10 people into prison. Because that's what we're doing right now, with no return on investment. So the idea as a systems approach is that at each intervention, we may start with 10, et cetera, et cetera. At each intervention, given their degree of involvement, we can motivate and take some people out. It's sort of like if we think about traffic offenses, right? There are some people, because the police just turned on the lights, that's enough for them to witness somebody to slow down, and they're not going to do it. Then there's some people who actually have to experience the police pulling you over. There are some people who then get warnings, and other people actually need to get a ticket. And other people just need to go through a plea in advance to keep their record clean before they won't do it. And there's other people I just need to prosecute and get them convicted of the charge. And each one of them is different, but we can't use a single theory to have as an approach. That's really what we're talking about. The other thing that now what we're doing, so this is the general theory. So now let me apply that to a very practical thing that we're doing in Salt Lake. So at Pioneer Park, one of the things that we're recognizing that we need to do, Salt Lake City really has what's called a Community Connection Center. And that's actually a community-based model. And the idea is that when this field contact occurs, instead of arresting them, how about we give them the information on that contact and refer them into the community over here, where we have community-based treatment support for those individuals. Now, I'll tell you, that doesn't always work, because I have people who will just say, that's a nice, yeah, I'll take advantage of that, Sim, but I'm not going to follow through. And I know that for some of these people, I really need to go now over here, and I need to go through the prosecution point to say, okay, here's your thing. You're going to either go to prison or you're going to go into treatment, right? So, but we are trying to explore how we can do field diversions, and Chief Brown and I have talked about this. I go, can we create a metric where we can sift through the screening process, where we can identify who would benefit, and let's do a field diversion so they never even enter into this pathway. But I am the first one to concede, there are going to be people that we will never be able to impact. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, you talk about these giant sums of money, but what if they did some more with, before any of this happened?
Yes.
Before recidivism?
Yes.
I was an administrator at Valley High School for many years, and when I see those kids, and we did with some kids, we didn't have enough counselors, we didn't have enough therapists, we didn't have enough people.
Yes. So here's another notion. School to prison pipeline. And this fits into the broader issues. So we have, for example, we decided that because we have schools and sometimes people get unruly, we came up with a great idea. They're called, I think they're called SROs, School Resource Officers. We took some police officer and we put them in the school. So then what happened as a result of that choice was the administrators and teachers witness a crisis. And instead of dealing it within the administrative teacher component, they kind of default to because I got Joe over here. Joe can help me, okay? And this SRO then led to the criminalization of it, and we saw this increase of people who are now being introduced into the criminal justice system. So we've done that. Now that's the institutional response. But your point is absolutely on the money, because the investment that we should be making up front is the one that we're neglecting for a default to the obligation of the money that we're required to spend on the back. We can have a better, if we look at the research, that's a better investment than me as a prosecutor or law enforcement being the crisis managers of our failed policies, right? That is the expensive part. And let me highlight that one more way to give you a more holistic response. If I was to say to you that I have 2 children, if I have a child, and if this child was physically beaten, emotionally tortured, sexually abused, it is not a big inference or a leap of faith to say that this person, when they grow up, is subsequently going to engage in criminal activity. Everybody here intuitively understands that. Childhood abuse is a contributor to subsequent criminality. But here's the other part a research showed. A co-contributor to subsequent criminality is also childhood neglect. Now think about that. Physical abuse we understand, right, intuitively. But childhood neglect, the failure to thrive, the failure to have the basic needs, the failure to have shelter, childhood neglect is a co-contributor to subsequent criminality. So if we know that, the investment that you're talking about is about recognizing that second part of the equation as a matter of public policy and making the investment that's necessary for that part of the equation. And that is something we are failing to do. That's what we need to go back to data and research. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been a study, and this is not going to sound popular to any of the men in the room, but to how many of these people that end up in a life of in and out the prison doors actually had a dad at home growing up?
You know, I'm sure that there is some study that's been done, because I would think of.
There has to be a relationship of that.
Yeah, and I think certainly if we talk about, look, I think that you and I, nobody here would disagree. The greater the stability that you and I can provide for a developing child, the better the outcome we're going to have. Now, having said that, the reality is sometimes different. Sometimes the abuse and is coming from that father. Sometimes the neglect is coming from that father. So I think in our ideal world, absolutely. The more supportive people I can put in there, the better outcomes we're going to have. I mean, it's not a big leap of faith. I mean, we can drive correlations between high school failure to graduate from high school versus people who graduate from high school in terms of both not only their economic future, but also their physical health that they'll more likely to, and subsequent criminality. And so we can make these analyses. I think, of course, the goal is under the infrastructure that we do have, then we will, what can we do? I've been told one last question if anybody wants one. If not, yes, ma'am.
I just want to say thank you for all you do.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. Thank you.